There are many more questions for you, and I'm trying to think of which would really best represent many people in the audience. This one, it seems to me, is one of those. The term suffering is repeatedly applied to people with disabilities by Peter Singer. What is his definition of suffering, and how do you know people with disabilities suffer because of their disability? Is suffering a cause for murder?
Well, obviously not everybody with a disability is suffering. I've never made any such claim. And lots of people without disability suffer in all sorts of ways. You know, suffering is a very broad term. It refers to a condition that someone has a strong aversion to, strongly dislikes being in that state. I think that's probably about as specific as I want to get, but we all know that it has degrees, and there's various things that different types of suffering, mental, physical, and so on. How do we know that someone is in that state? Well, I think sometimes we can observe it, particularly with the physical kind. We can observe it. I think we know when animals are suffering. Nigel Cameron talked about his elderly dog and how you might get into a state. I think anyone who's had a dog or a cat might know when there's a time when they make the judgment that that dog or cat's now ill and is suffering and is not likely to recover, and that's just then becomes pointless suffering. And I think one can make the same sorts of judgments, for example, with severely disabled infants in certain conditions. And I think physicians who've looked at some conditions, not all of them obviously, of some certain kinds of disabilities that are involved with fairly extreme suffering, and others that are not. And equally at the end of life, of course, generally conscious beings can tell you, self-aware beings who can use language, can communicate, can tell you that they're suffering. So those are ways that we can know too. But obviously if you're talking about infants with disabilities who are not actually suffering right there and then, you're making a judgment, you're making a prediction about what their life will be like. And I don't pretend that that's an easy thing to do. It's a difficult decision to make because the conditions may be varied. They may be cases where there is likely to be psychological suffering, and people will adapt in different ways to those conditions. So I think it's actually difficult to make those judgments, but as I said, I think we do make those judgments either way. We make those judgments when we keep infants alive, when we apply all the powers of modern medical technology to prolonging life, when we ensure that infants who 50 years ago would certainly have died within a week of birth do now live and do now have a life of 10 or 20 or longer years. So that's a decision that we make, and that's therefore based on a judgment, I think, that this life is one that is worth preserving. Conversely, the opposite decision is made on a different judgment.
Excuse me.